that the Nobel Peace Prize for 2011 is to be divided in 3 equal parts between Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Leymah Gbowee, and Tawakkol Karman.
The world's most coveted Peace Prize is split 3 ways between 2 women from Africa and 1 from the Middle East. An important step in the empowerment of women throughout the world, or an award that fuels the debate as to whether achievements are still judged on the grounds of gender rather than ability. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's among the most prestigious prizes on the planet, and at each year this time there's mounting suspense surrounding the announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize winner. On this occasion, the prize goes to 3 women. Here they are: Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Liberian peace activist Leymah Gbowee, and a Yemeni women's rights campaigner Tawakkol Karman.
We cannot achieve democracy and lasting peace in the world unless women obtain the same opportunities as men to influence developments at all levels of society.
Joining us now are our guests in Oslo, Geir Lundestad. He's the director of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. Also in Oslo, Fredrik Heffermehl. He's the author of the book, The Nobel Peace Prize, What Nobel Really Wanted. And in Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with the initial reactions to the Nobel Committee's choice. Fredrik Heffermehl in Oslo, what do you think?
Well, it's fantastic that they have rewarded the work of women and the role of women in the world. I mean, it's historic. It's a great thing, and it's been received by the peace movement and the women in the peace movement, of course, with very, very gratefully.
In Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis, your reaction?
I think it's great that there have been 3 women. There has been a shortage of women among the peace laureates of the Nobel Prize. But I also think there are some contradictions. I think that 2 of the activists asserted women's rights in their fight for peace in Liberia and for justice and the end of dictatorship in Yemen. I think the role of the president of Liberia, who was, of course, the only African head of state to welcome the U.S. Africa Command to set up military shop in her country, is a more complicated question.
Well, Geir Lundestad, also there in Oslo, give us briefly the reasons why the award were made to these 3 women.
Well, the committee has long looked at the importance of women in peacemaking and in establishing human rights. And we felt that these 3 were the crucial ones. I mean, if we wanted to go into the question of the role of women in war, in peace, and in establishing human rights, it was impossible to avoid the first democratically elected female president in Africa. And Leymah Gbowee has also made very substantial contribution to establishing peace in Liberia, but we did not want to focus exclusively on Liberia. We did want to bring in the Arab Spring, and Tawakkol Karman has made a substantial contribution well before the Arab Spring, and she's making substantial contributions right now. So by including these 2 different countries, Liberia and Yemen, we wanted to underline the fact that our message concerns Africa, and it concerns the Arab world, but it is really a global message.
Well, let me go to Fredrik Heffermehl on this particular point. Previous joint awards have normally been linked by geography, people being in the same place, or by processes, people being involved in the same process. Here you actually do have, as explained, 2 separate processes linked only by gender. Is there a hint here of gender activism, do you believe, Fredrik Heffermehl?
Well, I really have noted, I'm always interested in how the committee gives reasons for the prizes. And in this case, I am particularly glad they mentioned UN Resolution 1325, which was emphasizing the role of women in all peace processes. So I think the committee has to choose some people as examples, symbols of a cause. This role of women is so essential, and it's a great historic thing that the committee has emphasized the role of women.
But Phyllis Bennis, if you will just pick up on that point, though, of a touch of gender activism, perhaps. For the first time, there's a non-linkage between joint awards being made to people. In this case, it's 3 women. But it does appear to be that the only link between them is gender.
I think there's no doubt that, although I was not a fly on the wall, as they say, in the meetings of the Nobel Committee, I can't imagine that there was not significant pressure to honor the Arab Spring as a whole. That has been the process that has engaged the attention of the world in such a dramatic way this whole year. Not only about women. There was a statement from someone in the Nobel Committee that the oppression of women is the most important issue facing the Arab world. That's clearly not the view of many Arab women activists, as well as other women throughout the Arab world and elsewhere. But these were the notion of the Arab Spring as central to how people in the world perceived the struggle for peace this year was very key. I'm guessing that there was some pushback among some who may have found that too controversial, perhaps, or troublesome in other ways. So one way to deal with that would be to link it within a broader framework, in this case, the issue of women peacemakers. Well, one might wonder, particularly because today, of course, is the 10th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, women peace activists, the young parliamentarian Malalai Joya in Afghanistan, for instance, very well-known international peace activist, could have been involved as well. There could have been a host of others from so many places, Palestinian women, but many others. But I think that there was a clear sense that there had to be representation of the Arab Spring, and if the goal was to include the struggle for women's rights in the context of the struggle for peace, this was a way to do it.
Well, let's put that directly to Geir Lundestad. The linkage happening because of the necessity to recognize a momentous political event, the Arab Spring, and then creating this linkage on the basis of gender because of it. Was that the motivation behind the committee's choice?
No, I think you're wrong when you say that the only thing they have in common is gender. They also have in common the struggle for human rights and democracy and for women's rights in peace and in war. So I think it's simply wrong what you said there. We could only honor 3 women because that's the maximum. You cannot go beyond 3. And I think obviously there are several other good female candidates. This is not a prize directed against anyone, but it is in favor of the 3 we have chosen. And they have different, but they all have very impressive. They've all been very impressive examples of what women can do.
Well, Phyllis Bennis, I saw you shaking your head at the beginning of that.
Just to clarify, I did not say that the only thing they have in common is gender. What I said was that they come to their
but the host of the program said this
quite differently. Ah, okay. I certainly do not believe that. I do think that there is a big difference between a peace activist, someone like Lemag Bowie in Liberia, who has spent her life fighting against the civil war, organizing women for opposition to war and for peace. I think there's a big difference between her extraordinary work and the work of someone like the first elected president in an African country, the first woman elected president, who is, of course, a model in electoral politics for women. But her commitment to peace, I think, has been undermined by her willingness, the only head of state in Africa, her willingness to accept the U.S. military bases of the Africa Command in her country. that does not, to me, speak of someone who deserves a Nobel Prize.
Well, Fredrik Heffermehl, do you agree with that point being made there, that in some way the award is being slightly devalued by this linkage?
Oh yes, I agree very much with the Washington speaker. It's right on the point. And I always look at the reasons the committee is giving. And I always ask myself, why are they keeping Nobel a secret? Why are they absolutely uninterested in what Nobel wanted when he established this prize? And if you want to find out that, which is the core of a will, it's to find out what the testator intended. You will find out that the establishment of a global cooperation for global disarmament, that is the core of the issue. And if you want to find out how the testament came to existence, you see another woman, Bertha von Suttner. She was the key peace activist in the last years of Nobel's life. She prodded him constantly in her letters that he must do something big for the movement. Nobel joined the movement of the Austrian Society of Friends of Peace. He gave them lots of money, and he said, I will do something great something big for the movement. And when he had written the will, he wrote a letter to her. Now I've been obedient, I've done what you wanted. So there is absolutely no discussion that this is a prize for the peace movement seeking a new world order, a disarmed world order where nations do not threaten each other, do arms races, and threaten each other with extinction. This is such a great vision. It is so forward-looking that the things that the Nobel... I ask myself, why is the committee absolutely unwilling to show what Nobel really wanted?
Well, let's just take a look at this point of how it all came about. The Nobel Peace Prize was created by Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite. He asked that the prize be awarded to, and I quote, the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses. Yet many say that this, unfortunately, has not always been the case. In 1973, Henry Kissinger won the award for his work on the Vietnam Peace Accords, even though he'd instituted a secret bombing campaign against North Vietnam's army. In 1978, Menachem Begin was a Nobel winner, this despite his involvement in the King David Hotel bombing 32 years before. In 1994, Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for what was cited as their efforts to bring reconciliation to the Middle East. And in 2009, the prize went to Barack Obama for what was described as his efforts to strengthen cooperation between people, this a mere 2 weeks after he'd actually become president. Other controversial nominees have included Adolf Hitler, Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin, and Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini. But among other things, perhaps this list also reflects a willingness to recognize process rather than this achievement, completed achievement. Now, Geir Lundestad, we've heard there from Fredrik Heffermehl the question about whether the aims of Alfred Nobel are still being met, the intention. What is your view of that?
Well, all three of you have raised many different points. I don't know how long I have in answering all these points. We do not claim a perfect record through these 110 years. We may have made mistakes, but we claim a solid, respectable record. And we have received much praise for what we have been doing. Of course, we all know the will, we respect the will, but there is limited guidance in the will. The will was written in 1895, and it has to be interpreted in the light of modern concerns. The first point in Alfred Nobel's will is fraternity between nations. We do think that our recent environmental prizes, for instance, and the prize this year to the 3 women, indeed has to do with fraternity, if I could be permitted to use the term, fraternity or sisterhood or whatever. We definitely think that these prizes fall under the will. And Heffermehl's fundamentalist interpretation of the document we take exception to. But taking exception to what he is saying doesn't mean that we are not respecting the will. And to the point about Johnson Sirleaf, we have nothing against women succeeding. It's wonderful that she has been elected president and that she can be a role model for women in Africa. I don't understand what you have against success. And Liberia has many serious problems, but they are making progress in the economy, in education, in health and welfare, and in the promotion of women.
Yes, but if I may just interject, Mr. Lundestad, and I just want to put that question to you, though, which you were probably going to answer, but to rush it along, because we do want to get back to Fredrik Heffermehl's reaction to his fundamental opinions. But that issue about having to give sometimes the prize to processes rather than achievements. It has happened many times before that people have been given a prize before what they've been working for has been completed. Is that part of what goes with the job of the committee in deciding what to do and who to give it to, Geir Lundestad?
Well, there has to be a basis of achievement. You cannot just throw out a prize and hope that something will happen. But it's true that to many of these prizes there has been what has been called an aspirational aspect. Yes. And the argument that you should wait until the process is over, I mean, as a professor of history, I know that processes are never over. But we try to combine both aspects, basis of achievement, and with some prizes, not all. I mean, these 3 ladies, they have achieved certain basic things, but we definitely hope that further progress will result from this year's prize.
Well, Fredrik Heffermehl, to get back to that point of you are basing your argument on fundamentalist opinions, what's your response to that?
Well, I think Lundestad just mentioned he is a professor of history, and I am amazed that he is so little interested in what Nobel really wanted. He has been explained this a number of times. And in fact, Nobel was extremely to the point. He saw that the military is such a danger to the human race. This is true. That it was true then. It's much more true today with weapons that can annihilate the humanity anytime. So what the Nobel Committee is absolutely impenetrable to read in my book. I've explained it over and over in letters, in newspaper articles. Simple, clear, that Nobel responded to the most pressing, urgent issue of our time. In 1895, he saw this problem, and I ask myself, why is the committee unable to see this? And the answer is obvious. They are mainstream Norwegian politicians who are completely dedicated to this, build a strong military, and they believe in the military as a role in international politics, and they have the allegiance to NATO and to the United States. And in fact, they are deadly opposed to the intention of Nobel's will, so they are absolutely unsuited.
Well, I will get back to Geir Lundestad to respond to that in a moment, but let me go to Phyllis Bennis first, as the only guest who's actually outside Oslo, and ask for her opinion on this particular debate. And the only woman, indeed.
Thank you. You know, I'm less interested in what Alfred Nobel said 110 years ago. That's important historically, but to me, I think the definitions that we bring to the struggle for peace have changed. I think one of the greatest, I would say probably the greatest of the Nobel laureates, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., taught us an extremely important lesson when he said peace is not only the absence of war, but the presence of justice. So that the struggles for justice inherent in the Arab Spring, inherent in the work of ending Liberia's civil war, those are struggles for peace and for justice that, in my view, make perfect sense as Nobel Peace Prize examples, as new laureates. The question I had raised about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was certainly not in opposition to women succeeding. Let's not misstate what I said. What I said is that my concern about her being awarded the prize was her welcoming of the further militarization of her country by asking the United States military to set up shop for its new Africa Command, known as AFRICOM, in her country, the only African country willing to accept the headquarters. The U.S. refused that on the grounds that it did not have the infrastructure. But that, to me, does not speak to who deserves a Nobel Prize. It's not because she's successful as a woman. There are many successful women, I would hope, do not get the Nobel Prize. Condoleezza Rice comes to mind. Golda Meir comes to mind. These are not women who deserve the Nobel Prize simply because they are women who have succeeded. The question is the struggle for peace and for justice. And in this case, the question of the fight for democracy and against dictatorship in the Arab Spring that Tawakkol Karman played such a huge role in, not fighting particularly for women's rights, but asserting her right as a woman to mobilize other women in that fight, has been crucial. Very much the same as with Lema Bowie in Liberia. These are examples of fighters for justice and peace that make perfect sense, even if they have moved forward from Alfred Nobel's original conception of 110 years ago, when human rights had not been identified as an issue for the world, when environmental concerns were not an issue for the world that threatens the very survival of the world. So I applaud the Nobel Committee moving forward in that way.
But let's just, if I may, just go to Geir Lundestad. He's been waiting there to respond to something you said. I'm not looking for a response about the individual choices, clearly what the committee has made, but that wider overview, the statement made there that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee is in some way allied to Western values, to Norwegian political values. Your response to that particular criticism, Mr. Lundestad?
Well, to some extent this is true. Of course, Norwegian ex-politicians tend to believe in Norwegian values, but if these had been only Norwegian values, this would have been very provincial indeed. But I think human rights and democracy, they are indeed universal values. This is the whole point of the exercise. And we see that these values are being strengthened all the time. And many of the countries of the world subscribe to human rights and democracy, some of them only in theory. But of course, the Nobel Committee wants to encourage democracy and human rights. And what was said about Martin Luther King is absolutely true. I find this very inspiring and very much to the point. To Mr. Heffermehl, I will just say that he was against the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, and all committees have made certain decisions which he dislikes. So he has. There's not a single committee through our 110
well,
years
we've got to go at this stage.
The decisions that he wants it to make.
Let's hear very briefly at this stage from Fredrik Heffermehl, very briefly, if we may.
There is one thing that destroys human rights in the world. There's one thing that destroys democracy, and one thing that creates poverty and exempts resources. And there's one thing that costs enormous amounts of money and is hurting women particularly, and that is militarism. We have, and it is what we do for our security is the most dangerous thing we are doing. It costs a lot, and it can cost us our lives anytime. So
well, we just have to have the final point, if I may, Mr. Heffermehl, to go to Phyllis Bennis very quickly. And just remember that all the Nobel Peace Prize awards, 776 men through the decades as opposed to 40 women. Does this signal perhaps a change in that kind of attitude, very briefly?
I think that it's very important that women's contributions to the struggles for peace and justice and human rights and environmental protection are finally being recognized more routinely by the Nobel Committee.
Well, thank you so much to our guests in Oslo, Geir Lundestad, also in Oslo, Fredrik Heffermehl, and in Washington, Phyllis Bennis. And thank you all so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.